Wow. Self-determination ought not be in name only. Some powerful words that Cindy Blackstock generously shared with us, and the amazing resources that she showed on her video there, and just sending good energy to all of us in the room. I really felt that come through her words, and we're worth it. We are so worth it. I have the huge honor of introducing our next speaker, who's going to speak with us about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Marian Buller is a member of the Mistawasis Nehiyawak Nation, a Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. She started her legal career as a lawyer practicing in criminal, administrative, and human rights law. She was the commission counsel for the Cariboo Chilcotin Justice Inquiry. She was the director and president of the Indigenous Bar Association and other organizations. Ms. Buller was the first Indigenous woman appointed as a provincial court judge in BC. She presided in courts in many locations around BC, including the Northern Circuit Court. She founded the First Nations Court and provided the foundations for Indigenous Families Court. There are courts that consider the special circumstance. These are courts that consider special circumstances for Indigenous people. She's written extensively about Indigenous human rights. After 22 years, Ms. Buller was appointed to the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This was a precedent-setting and truly national inquiry. The National Inquiry's strongly worded final report and calls to justice have attracted both national and international attention. We just want it to attract action now. Our team has used that report quite a bit. You can do searches in the report and find things that can contribute to proposals that you're writing. The one that we keep going back to is the word silence, just the impact of silence throughout our society and what impact that has had in this situation. Ms. Buller has received numerous awards in recognition of her contributions to the advancement of Indigenous and human rights, including the inaugural YWCA Women of Distinction Award for Reconciliation and Action. And it is my huge pleasure to welcome Ms. Buller here today.
Thank you very much. Welcome to my home. Welcome to my home on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And because we're gathering today by Zoom and in person, I also want to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral homes of the Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people from coast to coast to coast. Thank you, Native court workers, for inviting me to be with you today. It really is my pleasure. And oh my goodness, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, following her, I was just about jumping out of my chair listening to her. So I'll try to do my best to follow up and keep you interested today. Thank you, Anne Wannock, for starting us in a good way this morning. Breathing, yeah, that's really important, especially after hearing Dr. Blackstock. And Anne, thank you very much for wearing your red shirt today. That means a lot to me. Today, I'm going to talk about the work of the National Inquiry, the findings in our final report. I'm going to talk about the calls for justice. I'll give you a little bit of an update on what's been happening since the end of the National Inquiry, and then talk about moving forward and action. Doing stuff, you know, we talked about it, let's do stuff. Now, I also am going to hopefully leave enough time for some discussion, some dialogue, because that's really how we all learn. Now, from time to time, as you can tell, I'm looking down. It's because I have to refer to some notes because I can't remember everything off the top of my head that I want to tell you today. I don't want to miss out on anything. So don't worry, I'm not texting anybody and I'm not playing video games while I'm talking to you. Now, also, I have my other sort of caveat I have to start with is I'm going to be talking about some difficult subjects this morning. I don't mean to trigger anyone. And if I do, I apologize in advance. If you feel triggered by what I'm talking about this morning and our discussion, please reach out to the court workers for help. Don't be afraid to do that. There's absolutely no shame in reaching out for help. So let's get on, let's roll up our sleeves and get busy here. Well, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The National Inquiry came about as the result of about 40 years of activism by Indigenous women and organizations all across Canada for years. And I know some of those activists, I know you're there, are attending today. Thank you for the work that you have done in the past. And thank you for the work that you're still doing to stop this genocide in Canada. Now, the terms of reference for the National Inquiry were actually quite lengthy, and I can kind of summarize them as this. The commissioners and I were required to inquire into all forms of systemic violence, all causes of systemic violence against Indigenous women and girls, and we added 2S or Two-Spirit people to that reference. So it was systemic causes, all types of violence against Indigenous women and girls in 2S. Also, we were required to make recommendations to change or stop that violence, of course, and recommendations about how to commemorate our lost loved ones. We started our work on September 1st, 2016, and we finished, well, we didn't finish our work, but our mandate ended on June 30th, 2019. So we had just a little bit over 2.5 years to do all that work from coast to coast to coast. It was a lot of work, as you can no doubt tell. This was the first truly national inquiry in Canada. And by that, I mean, the National Inquiry was created not only by the federal government, but every province and territorial government in Canada. So actually, from a legal perspective, we were 14 different inquiries all operating at the same time. This created a lot of headaches for us and our outstanding legal team, but we got over those hurdles. It was a first, never happened before, as I said. And I must add, it was a true honor to lead the National Inquiry and work with some absolutely amazing people. In total, we heard from 2,386 people about their experiences with lost loved ones and also their experiences with violence. We held public hearings from coast to coast to coast. Some of them were covered by the media. We heard from family members of lost loved ones during those public inquiries. We also heard from survivors of violence. We added survivors of violence to our mandate because we thought that survivors of violence would be able to teach us about how to end violence, how to get out of violence. And you know, we learned a lot from them, and I thank them all. We were trauma informed as best we could, given our legal framework, in the work that we did. And we gave choice to people who wanted to share their truths, their stories about their lost loved ones, their stories about experiences with violence. So people could share their truths with us in public, in front of one or more commissioners, or they could share their truths in private, in front of one or more commissioners, or with a statement gatherer, one of our staff members, who would have a more informal approach to taking or hearing truths. Now, I just want to step aside here for a moment and say we did a lot of things differently in this national inquiry. And I won't say, well, no, I will say we broke laws regarding, we broke Canadian laws regarding national inquiries or inquiries of any sort. Because from the very get-go, I wanted the national inquiry to feel like we were having tea at my kitchen table, talking about a lost loved one, or talking about experiences with violence. Because with my experience as a judge, I knew this would be a horribly traumatic experience for people. And so I wanted to make it as easy as possible, although still bearing in mind that was a hard task. So we took it as best we could, given our legal framework and breaking laws, I might add. We didn't require people to swear oaths on a Bible, promise to tell the truth, or do anything of that nature. If they wanted to swear an oath on a Bible, certainly they could do that, or they could promise to tell the truth. But if they preferred to hold an eagle feather or to share their truths in ceremony or not at all, that was fine too. Because our starting point is, or was, we believe you. We believe that you are telling us the truth about your experiences. And because we believed people were telling us the truth, their truths, as we all call them, there was no cross-examination of family members and survivors of violence. They just told their truth. Now, from time to time, commissioners would ask questions like, could you please repeat the date, or could you please repeat the location that you were at? It was just more to clarify what we heard, as opposed to, challenging someone, saying, the assumption that they're lying, or that sort of thing. So we didn't come from that perspective at all. All of our work, regardless of where we were, was done in local ceremony. So we wanted to bring ceremony and tradition and language into all of the work that we did do. And so every day started with prayers and drumming and singing and a sacred fire. Every day finished with singing and a lot of tears, more often than not, drumming, and the sacred fire wasn't put out until we finished our work. And I have to add, the ashes from every sacred fire across Canada were carried with us to the very end until our final sacred fire, and all the ashes were joined together in that fire. Now, on all occasions where we had public hearings and where statement gatherers met with people, we had health support available, both on the ground and then after the fact. Now, I have to just explain to you a little bit about the statement gatherers. These were the people that did the hard work of the National Inquiry without any media coverage, without a lot of thanks. They went to small communities where we couldn't go because we left a rather large footprint wherever we went. And we wanted people to be able to share their truths regardless of where they were in Canada. So the statement gatherers made those long journeys on those gravel roads and flew into small communities. They met with family members and survivors at nursing stations, band offices, gas stations, on occasion in people's own homes. They did the very hard work of gathering those truths. And I'm very grateful for all the work that they did do. They did the hard work. Now, we also knew that there were some people who just could not share face-to-face, regardless of who they were sharing with. So we invited submissions that we called artistic expressions. And those artistic expressions included letters from people about their lost loved ones, newspaper articles about lost loved ones, diaries, some clothing items, some artwork, and that all became part of our work as well. Now, I have to say, again, The National Inquiry staff were amazing. They spent weeks away from their homes. They missed graduations, birthday parties, wedding anniversaries, holidays, because they were so dedicated to the work of the National Inquiry. All of us, all Canadians, can never thank the amazing staff of the National Inquiry enough for the work that they did do. So thank you, wherever you are, all of you. Now, in addition to the community hearings, where we heard from family members and survivors, we also had 9 subject matter hearings. During these hearings, we heard from elders, traditional knowledge keepers, academics, some other professional people, a wide variety actually of people. And I think I can do this off the top of my head still. The subject matter hearings were, and I have to count them on my fingers here, were policing, child welfare, government services, colonial violence. Okay, I have to look at my notes. I'll go back to it. Policing, criminal justice, child welfare, racism, human rights, colonial violence, sex industry and trafficking, government services, Indigenous laws, and decolonization. I used to be able to do that off the top of my head, pardon me. Our hearings were held from coast to coast to coast, and all were open to the public, and of course the media as well. Now, another thing that we did that was a little different was we only went where we were welcome. We only went where we were invited, because in my experience during the circuit courts as a judge, I remember going to communities with the court where we weren't welcome. And I wasn't going to inflict or impose the National Inquiry on any community. I believed that that was being too colonial by inflicting the National Inquiry. In addition to our hearings, we held roundtables or guided dialogues, just so we could narrow in and focus in on some more specific issues. So we had guided dialogues regarding the specific issues faced by Inuit across Canada, by Métis people across Canada, by Two-Spirit people across Canada, and also the special issues faced by Indigenous women and girls and 2S people in Quebec, because their history, especially with the Roman Catholic Church, is so much different than elsewhere in Canada. Now, also, the commissioners and I visited all of the penitentiaries for women in Canada, across Canada. Either one of us or more than one of us went to each of the penitentiaries. It was a real eye-opener for me. In our visits to the penitentiaries, we spoke with the women inmates, we spoke to staff, and we also spoke to elders, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity as well. Behind the scenes, we had an excellent research team who did an amazing job of not only reviewing and synthesizing existing work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, they did new research as well. Their work was amazing. I can't speak highly enough about the work that they did do. We also produced an education guide. It's called Their Voices Shall Guide Us. And this is an education guide to be used really by anybody who's teaching. And it goes from the kindergarten level to post-secondary. And it's how to teach about the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We produced 2 reports. The first report was our interim report, on time, on budget, November 2017. And then we produced our final report in June of 2019. It's entitled Reclaiming Power and Place. Why that title? Well, after doing some of the work, it became very apparent to us. And by the time we finished our work, it was even more apparent to us that the way to end violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people is to decolonize. in a trauma-informed way in order to restore Indigenous women and girls and 2S people to their rightful places of power and place and influence. We also produced 2 supplementary reports, again, one on the special circumstances faced by Indigenous women and girls and 2S people in Quebec, and also a special supplementary report about the issue of genocide, because we knew our finding would be very controversial. Now, I have to say, all of these documents, plus more, are still available on our website, mmiwg-ffada.ca. Now, I'll turn to our major findings of fact in our final report. Now, pardon me, I just have a, excuse me. There were 4 pathways that maintain violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. There's the multi-generational and intergenerational trauma, historical and present, that has existed and continues to exist in Canada because of colonization. There is also, has been, pardon my, English is my first language. There has been and continues to be social, economic, and political marginalization of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. There is the maintenance of the status quo and institutional lack of will, silence, as Dr. Blackstock said. And of course, there's the complete dismissal. And I can even go, not dismissal, but rejection, conscious rejection of the expertise and agency of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. Now, those were the major findings in it, and I'm going to talk about genocide in a little bit. But we also found that there were the domestic laws in Canada have failed to protect Indigenous women and girls, 2S people, and continue to fail to protect Indigenous women, girls, and 2S people. We also found that there's no reliable and accessible mechanism in Canada for Indigenous women and girls, 2S people, and men as well, to seek recourse and remedies for their rights violations. We also found that Indigenous women and girls, 2S people, have been displaced from their traditional roles in governance and leadership. We also found that Indigenous governments or bands do not have the full trust of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, and are not seen as representing their interests. We found, and it'll come as no surprise to you, that Indigenous self-determination and self-governance are required to properly serve and protect Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And again, no surprise to so many of you, Indigenous women's advocacy organizations and grassroots organizations are underfunded and undersupported, and short-term or project-based funding models in service areas are not sustainable and represent a violation of inherent rights to self-governance. And we found numerous rights violations in the areas of health, culture, human security, and justice. I'll turn briefly to our finding of genocide. I won't bore you with the legalities of the UN definition of genocide. But what I will tell you is we heard and we found more than enough evidence to support our finding of genocide. It became an inescapable conclusion. We heard about the residential system and the horrors experienced by children in the residential school system, and the horrors that they still continue to experience and their families have experienced. Dr. Blackstock has already described some of them, and I don't want to repeat them because they are so horrific. We heard about forced relocation of Indigenous people all across Canada that led to starvation, that led to lack of access to traditional medicines, that led to a myriad of health, social, political, and economic problems. We heard about the forced sterilization of Indigenous women for generations. We heard about forced assimilation of Indigenous women and girls and men to their children, their young boys as well. We heard more than enough to support our finding of genocide, deliberate policies, deliberate inaction, deliberate negligence by governments across Canada. So, what do we need to do about all this? Well, first of all of us, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, governments at all levels, we need to change our way of thinking. We need what we wrote as a paradigm shift, away from doing to and doing for Indigenous people across Canada, that whole colonial attitude, to doing with Indigenous people and doing by Indigenous people. We have to get away from that original colonial thinking of settlers' ways being inherently superior to non-Indigenous ways, and a firm belief in the inferiority of Indigenous ways. We have to get away from that colonial thinking. We have to decolonize. We have to move towards self-government and self-determination. We have to take an Indigenous and human rights approach to strategic long-term planning in all areas of life, in all areas of governance. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's talk about housing, on reserve housing. Now, as it stands, on reserve housing is program-based, project-based, needs determined by outsiders, budget decided to a large extent by outsiders. These are programs, projects that can be cut at the whim of government and government economic and budgetary planning. We say, no, that's the wrong approach. We have to move away from that. Let's not do to, let's not do for, let's not do favors for Indigenous people. Let's recognize their basic human right to safe housing. And let's start from the position of honoring and respecting their human right for safe housing by turning housing into core funding that can't be cut, because this is a human right that must be respected, and it must be done in partnership with and by Indigenous people themselves. That's the paradigm shift that we all have to make. And Indigenous women and girls especially have to be equal partners at all decision-making tables, at all levels of governance, business, and service provision. Now, all of what I've told you, as I've said, is still available at our website, mmiwg.ca, mmIWG-ffada.ca. And you'll see photographs, videos from our hearings, transcripts of public evidence, as well as an executive summary of our report, as well as the full final report. You'll also be able to see our interim report and our education guide, Their Voices Shall Guide Us. Now, enough of kind of the heavy stuff. Let's talk about moving ahead and the 231 calls for justice. Okay, don't panic, 231. It's a lot, I know, but they're broken down by audience. And just as an aside, I want to tell you how we decided on the name Calls for Justice. We were talking at a meeting of commissioners, and our research director, the most talented and brilliant Dr. Corinne Duhamel. And so what do we call our recommendations that we have to make? And we didn't want to call them calls for action because we didn't want to interfere with the brilliant work done by the TRC or be seen to be interfering with the brilliant work of the TRC. Dr. Duhamel said, you know, I keep hearing, what do families want? What do survivors want? They want justice. And so thanks to Dr. Corinne Duhamel and her brilliance, we called our recommendations Calls for Justice. Thank you, Dr. Duhamel. And thank you, family members and survivors, for telling us you want justice. And I hope we brought you that through our report. So, as I said, Calls for Justice, broken down by audience or target group. So don't worry. The first large group that we aimed our calls for justice at or to were all governments, including Indigenous governments across Canada, be they traditional governments or Indian Act governments. Now, we again broke those down into subgroups aimed at all governments. And I have to go back to my notes here. We broke down our calls for justice aimed at governments to include human and Indigenous rights and government obligations. So talking about human rights, rather than respecting human rights rather than doing us favors. Then calls for justice aimed at culture, health and welfare, human security, and justice. Then we broke down our calls for justice to other audiences or target groups. And again, I have to read them because I don't want to leave any of them out. So here's the list: media and social influencers, the transportation and hospitality industry, social workers and those in child welfare, extractive and development industries, the criminal justice system, police services, attorneys and law societies, educators, health and wellness service providers, and Correctional Services Canada. And then we made calls for justice that all Canadians can work on and work for. Now, I'm just going to highlight some of the calls for justice. And I'm going to look at victim services, policing, and child welfare in particular. Not word for word, but just sort of paraphrasing them. Victim services created a whole area for us to look into because it was a real problem area for a lot of people. We've heard that victim services across Canada were really a patchwork of services. In some areas, there were no victim services. In some areas, there were problems with accessibility to victim services. In some areas, there were real funding problems with victim services. The list goes on. And so family members and survivors of violence were really being left out in the cold. They just didn't have the support that they needed. And so we said there has to be accessible, properly funded, long-term victim services available all across Canada. And that wasn't just aimed at Indigenous women and girls. We had to look at services being available for men and boys as well. I know there was reference to men and boys, and I have to say, a lot of our calls for justice do look at the violence faced by Indigenous men and boys, and recommendations or calls for justice to study how to educate Indigenous men and boys about violence. So that's just an aside. I wanted to add that. So there are a lot of calls for justice regarding victim services. That needs to be improved all across Canada. Policing, oh, huge area, as you no doubt know. We heard a lot of support for Indigenous police services across Canada. Indigenous communities want Indigenous policing. But we found that the Indigenous police services that do exist more often than not are underfunded, under-resourced, and are projects, they're programs, they're not protected by legislation. So of course we turned that around and said, no, Indigenous policing services have to be properly funded, properly resourced. Indigenous police officers have to be properly trained and retained, and they have to be protected by legislation. We also heard about so much about policing services and how they impact Indigenous safety for, how they impact safety for Indigenous women and girls. And so we made many, many calls for justice regarding policing, including specialized units in urban police services and training, mandatory training for police services, whether they're Indigenous or not. So huge area there as well. Regarding child welfare, where to start? And Dr. Blackstock, has spoken very learnedly about child welfare changes, but I just want to add what we heard all across Canada was the need for keeping our children at home and to stop fueling the huge foster care industry all across Canada. Rather, let's strengthen and support our children and our families at home. And we made calls for justice to do just that. Let's stop fueling that huge industry. Let's take care of our children. Our children are worth it. We also, in deference, of course, to Dr. Blackstock, said, implement the Spirit Bear plan. So I'm going to come to the calls for justice regarding all Canadians in just a moment. Bear with me. I just want to give you a brief update on what's been happening regarding our calls for justice since the end of the national inquiry. After the work ended, or the national inquiry ended, the work will never end, but when our mandate ended on June 30th, 2019, my role actually ended, and nobody in government or anywhere else for that matter has to report to me. The difficulty I've felt or found, because I like to keep up on what's happening, is there's no one place to go to. There's no one website to go to find out what's happening. So I've been able to piece together what's happening or isn't happening. At the national level, as most of you know, there's a national action plan that has been filed. It's called the Federal Pathway. Now, in that document, they set out a timeline, an aspirational timeline for publishing and presenting an implementation plan. They haven't met those deadlines, and I suppose the federal election may be or may not be an excuse for that. I'll leave that up to you. You be the judge. But the National Action Plan was really more of an aspirational document than an implementation plan. That's my opinion anyway. Yukon, amazing work done in the Yukon. After we filed our final report, Yukon government hit the ground running. They established a tripartite committee, Yukon government, First Nations government, and Indigenous organizations. And they visited every community in the Yukon, said, okay, what are the priorities? How are we going to move forward and implement? Don't have to study anymore. What are the priorities for implementation? They came up with 31 actions to take in their document, and I have to read the title, Changing the Story to Upholding Dignity and Justice. They were able to file that in December of 2020. I heartily recommend that you read that document. Just Google MMIWG and Yukon, and you'll come up with a variety of summaries in the actual document itself. In Ontario, the Ontario Native Women's Association and the Ontario government have moved forward with large projects to prosecute and combat human trafficking. And they've also started working on other ways to implement our other calls for justice. Some interesting stories, more sort of on a local level. The family members in Winnipeg were very maybe angry is the right word, but not happy with the way Winnipeg Police Services were conducting investigations into the missing and murdered. And so they met with the chief of the Winnipeg Police Services and started working on a new relationship that actually is quite positive, or more positive anyway, between the Winnipeg Police Services and family members of missing loved ones. That dialogue has started in a positive way. In Saskatoon, after we filed our final report, the mayor said to City Council, okay, you've got the summer to read this report. When we come back in September, we're going to develop an action plan. And the mayor actually also challenged the hospital boards, police boards, others to do the same. And they have started working on action plans based on their own priorities and their own jurisdictions. In Vancouver, shout out to the Vancouver MMIWG Coalition. I know you're there. Believe me, you're doing the most amazing work to press governments at all levels for change here in the Vancouver area and in BC generally. So thank you for your work. Don't give up. I support you 110%. In Saskatchewan, communities are not waiting for governments to do the work. They're doing the work themselves to develop their own action plans with their own priorities. So things are happening. It's just difficult to find out what's going on. There are new partnerships, but there are new relationships being built across Canada, new dialogues, and that can only be good. So next steps, what to do. Okay, now I'm going to be watching you in all of this. But I want to share with you one of my very most favorite stories from the National Inquiry about how people can make change. I heard from 4 sisters in private, so I can't tell you their names. I can't tell you where their community was or still is. But I can share, I have their permission to share their story. They shared with me their truth about their lost loved one. And after that, we got into a more informal conversation. And this is what they shared with me. In their community, they were trying to develop this community safety plan, and it just was going nowhere quickly. And so one of the sisters, I think she was the oldest one, said, maybe we have to clean up our own homes first before we can move forward at the community level. And so she came up with this idea to end violence in her own home. And she came up with these rules, and I hope I remember them all. To end violence, there will be no physical violence in the home, like no pushing, no shoving, no fighting, no verbal arguments, no yelling unless it's an emergency, no lateral violence, no drugs, no alcohol, no gang paraphernalia. I think there was also no rap music, no swearing. One of the sisters said, that was really hard for me. There were other rules as well about, no taking other people's stuff without their permission. And the bottom line was, the final rule was, if you don't like it, leave, because these rules applied to everybody in the home. The other sisters followed along. Now, what they found over a period of time was they started to realize how much little, I think they're called microaggressions or little bits of violence were happening in their homes every day. And they found that their homes were becoming more peaceful and actually more cheerful. And they were replacing violence with their more traditional teachings of respect, humility, and honesty, amongst others. Now, people in the community were initially very critical and kind of laughed at them. But then people in the communities started to see that, well, first of all, it didn't matter if you lived in these sisters' homes or if you were just visiting, the rules applied to you. So people in the community had to, if they were visiting, they had to follow these rules too. And at first they were very skeptical. But after a while, other families in their community started imposing or setting down the same ground rules of no violence in our home. And the sisters shared with me that after a while, and I'm going to say it took about a year, they started talking about the community safety plan again, and things started to move. And it wasn't a community safety plan about rules of enforcement. It became more about how can we head off problems before they start. And I have to say, I hear from them every so often now, and there's an amazing amount of progress that they're making in their own home communities. I also have to say, I still hear from that one sister who says that no swearing, as she says, the no cussing, that's still really hard for me. So it still takes effort, and I just think they've done wonderful work. So it just shows you how one person can start change in a whole community and lead the way. So I just wanted to share that with you. So let's go to the calls for justice for all Canadians to work on, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, it doesn't matter. This is our to-do list, regardless of who you are. Now, first of all, before we come into ourselves and our own brains and hearts, let's talk about those around us, like the sisters did. So for your associations and your organizations, who's at the decision-making table? Are Indigenous women and girls there as equal partners? And if not, why not? And what are you going to do to make that change? Does your organization, does your workplace have a reconciliation plan, a decolonization plan? If not, why not? And why don't you get things started? Is there zero tolerance for racism, for violence in your workplace? If not, why not? And get one started. You can do it. If you're in the education area, are you indigenizing curricula? If not, why not? And you're the right person to start it. So there's a bit of a to-do list, huh? So let's move into our own selves a little bit more. What we said in the calls for justice. And there's several of them. I'm going to paraphrase them in the interest of time here. Call out racism, sexism, violence, transphobia, homophobia, whenever and wherever you see it. And support those who call out those isms, because they're trolls everywhere, and we need to support each other. Educate yourself about the real history of Canada, because we haven't been taught it, and we're just starting to learn the real history of Canada. The University of Alberta has the online Indigenous Canada education program. It's free. You can do it on the internet. You can learn a lot for nothing. Google Indigenous and Canada, and there'll be so many resources that come available for you. You know what I tell people? You know, when you're in the lineup at Tim Hortons, or you're waiting at the checkout at Costco or some other place, you don't know what to do, just get your phone out and Google Indigenous in Canada and learn something. Make that time in the lineup worthwhile. It doesn't have to be formal. There are little ways of learning that are really important, I might add. Social media. Follow Indigenous media. Follow Indigenous organizations. Follow Indigenous leaders. Follow Indigenous critics. Educate yourself. Make it just part of what you do, if you aren't already. Reading. Now, there are tremendous Indigenous authors who write fiction and nonfiction books. How many of you read? Come on, be honest. Add them to your reading list. And if you belong to a book club, insist on Indigenous authors as part of your reading list for your book club. If you don't already, follow the news on APTN and CBC Indigenous. Learn about the news through an Indigenous lens. Read, of course, the National Inquiry's executive summary, but I'd like you to read the full report, of course. Read the TRC report and executive summary. For yourself, establish a zero tolerance for violence and carry through like those sisters did, even though the cussing part might still be a problem. Because, you know, it's the little things that count. It's the little education bits that count every day that will make a difference. We have to know our past in order to know our future. And we have to know what we're going to be and what we are reconciling about. You know, one person can make a difference. As the Nike Corporation said, just do it. Just do it. And I want to conclude by saying this. Darlene, thank you for your years of service. And Darlene, have a wonderful retirement, more than anything. Thank you so much.
I might be guilty of having a potty mouth. So, oh my Gouda. Gilakasla, thank you so much, Honorable Buller, for your warm, gracious, intrepid leadership, and to all of your team who have traveled from coast to coast to coast to do this really hard work. I wish you could see all of our faces in the room here. There were so many heads nodding, lots of laughter. I don't know if you could hear all of that. I'm hoping that was the same for everyone who was online. I think one thing I was thinking about as you were speaking was when we go back to our ancestral and traditional ways, one thing we were really good at is just being human together and in relationship. And I feel even in the last year and a half, we've been able to do that in such a good way and an intimate way through all of this stuff. So, Gilakasla, thank you so much.
And really powerful words that you shared. You know, the need for the paradigm shift to move away from doing to and for. Really, self-determination is at the core of it. Well, just one more reminder, if this has been hard for anyone, please reach out to the court workers for support or let us know if there's anything that you need. Again, take the time that you need. We're going to move into the question and answer period now. So as before, if anyone has a question or a comment that they would like to share, there are the 3 microphones set up at the back and over to the 2 sides. And same as yesterday, we'll be taking comments from the online community as well, back and forth. So just opening the floor up if there's anyone who has a comment or a question for the Honorable Marian Buller.
Are they going to put it on the screen again? Is it on? Okay. Hi, Marian. It's Mabel. I just wanted to get up and say hi and thank you for the great presentation. And I miss you so much. And this is the first time I've heard this presentation. And I had a question about the Indigenous Canada course that you talked about from the University of Alberta. I took that course COVID time. And is there going to be any information about what you just discussed in there? Because I know there wasn't when I took that course.
Well, Mabel, hi. And I can't see you, but it's nice to hear you. Oh, now I can see you. Oh, okay. Hello, everyone, and hello, Mabel. I'm so low tech, you know. The short answer is I don't know.
Okay, I don't want to see me. I want to see her.
The short answer is I don't know.
There we go. Yay, thank you. So, yes, do you know if your presentation will be in the curriculum for that Indigenous Canada?
They haven't approached me directly. So the short answer is I really don't know what they're going to do to revise their curriculum. But tell me, how did you find that course? Did you learn anything from it?
I thought it was going to be easy. I struggled with parts of it because you actually need to pay attention, and I had to do one of the tests a few times, and it was hard because I was doing it while I was working as well, so it was pretty much after work stuff. So it did take a lot, and I barely squeaked by for some of the parts. But that's just me. I think I have ADD sometimes. So yeah, it would have been interesting to hear some of your stuff in there as well. So I was just thought I would ask that. And the other question I had is, are you going to write a book?
Well, I have it in my head, and it's called Truth is Stranger Than Fiction. Because some of the things that happened in court, you just could not make up. As court workers know, and others know, oh boy, truth is stranger than fiction. No, I don't have any plans for that, but thank you for asking.
Because you are an amazing woman and you're such a great inspiration and mentor for all of us. And I just needed to say that as well. And if you did write a book, I would buy copies and give them to everybody.
Oh.
Because I love you and I miss you.
Well, I miss you too, Mabel. I miss you too. Thank you so much.
Lamisen qila kaslaki silako. Ay nukwam okwila kame kaya kamuskuma tawadeno. First of all, Honorable Buller, my admiration is just totally there. My name is Okwilakame from the 4 tribes, the Muskuma Jawadeno, north of Vancouver Island way here. And the heavy lifting of gathering information is a lot, so much that I can't even imagine. I cannot even imagine what goes to your mind and your heart as you're proceeding during your day. My question to you is, how do you maintain yourself? What's your self-care?
Well, there's some people who say I don't maintain myself, but thank you so much for such a caring question. I really appreciate it. During the course of the National Inquiry, as I said earlier, we did all of our work in ceremony. And that's what kept me going and kept me on an even keel as best I could. And my own teachings kept me centered and halfway healthy. I knew going in it was going to be very, very difficult work. I kind of, got myself ready for that as well. I had the benefit of an elder as well to help me, Elder Kathy Lewis, who slapped me around when I needed slapping around and comforted me when I needed to be comforted. So it was tradition, it was Indigenous ways, it was my beliefs that kept me able to carry that load and hopefully help other people carry that load too. So now I'm back practicing law and trying to keep that balance, because I was raised with the medicine wheel teachings, and I'd always try to keep that balance. So thank you for your very kind question and comment. Thank you.
Kira Kesla, thank you for, it's almost like experiential teaching. You have taught me what goes on upstairs happens in your heart and your mind, and how do they travel back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And in all that is your happiness and your survival. Kira Kesla, thank you.
Thank you for that. We definitely, that came through yesterday, ceremony as a way for self-healing, that healing process. So appreciate that. We have a question from a Mary Angus in the Zoom room. She asks, is it a funding issue that takes time to respond to missing Indigenous women? Because there is a much quicker response to non-Indigenous youth. There is a young man on the coast and there seems to be a quick response.
Oh, Mary, great question. You know, where to start? We know, we don't have to tell anyone that who gets the headlines, who gets the care, who gets the service, who gets the follow-up. It's not the Indigenous people who go missing. Men, women, boys, girls, to us people. You know, we know. Hence, recommendations or calls for justice aimed at the media. I don't think it's funding at all. Well, it may be partly due to funding, but you know, a lot of it has to do with priorities. Who's important? Who do the media see as important? Who has the power to create a fuss? Who has the power to make it difficult for those in power? Not you and me. So, you know, it's the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? That's what it is. I could go on for hours, but Mary, you've raised a really important point, and it's just, we've been marginalized for so long, our stories haven't counted, and we have to put an end to that.
Most certainly, we could go on that question for a long time of who's important. As Cindy Blackstock said, and as we all know, we are worthy, and being squeaky and elbowing our way in and having a voice is really critical. We have a question in the room, and then we have another question from the Zoom room, and really appreciate the online comments and questions. If people online would like to share anything, I have my little phone ready to share them out.
Hi, my name is Vandana, and thank you for presenting today. I think I've learned so much. It's very inspiring to see women in leadership take such a strong stance on advocating for Indigenous people. Just processing all of this, I understand how important it is to decolonize so many programs and practices. My question for you is, what is the government doing to open up these work opportunities for Indigenous leaders who can represent these workplaces and do the decolonization themselves?
Ooh, tough question. The short answer is, if anybody's doing it, it's impossible to find out. Federal, you know, it's not, I'm not being critical of you at all. You've raised a really interesting point. especially given the recent announcement by the federal government of a non-Indigenous male heading the MIWG Secretariat in Ottawa. I don't think that there's an accounting given by government anywhere, or maybe the Ontario government, about what their hiring practices are and the steps that they're taking to decolonize. Again, it used to be pardon me for using a violent expression, but kind of a scattergun, shotgun thing that's going on, and there just doesn't seem to be one place to go to find out all this stuff. The short answer is, I wish I knew.
I think it's just so important to provide support that looks different in every aspect, especially with financial stability and seeing these Indigenous leaders in Indigenous powerful, empowering roles to increase the awareness and representation, but also to empower others through the actual source. I think that's so important, especially in workplaces where we're trying to take on these, I guess, these initiatives, but it still, I feel like I'm struggling to see it stick because it's not feeling authentic because of the lack of representation. So I really want to, if anyone has any resources on what that hiring protocol looks like, or yeah, feel free to let me know. I'm always willing to learn. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think Honorable Buller gave us really good advice about following Indigenous leaders on different social media and so forth. I know that the First Nations Technology Council here in BC are doing a lot of work with the technology industry on making space, but like making safe space for Indigenous people to get into technology. So I think, as you were saying, to follow APTN, follow other social media to find out what's happening for like the phenomenal leadership that is here in this room, paving the way for us.
We have another question from Sue Ward online. Sue says, thank you for your important work. Do you have ideas on how we can incorporate the ways of Indigenous court into the mainstream youth justice system?
Oh, great question. Hold me down, because I'll get going on this one. Thank you so much for the question. Just by way of background, when we started the First Nations court in New Westminster, we had youth court matters come in to the court. That was the whole idea. And in fact, when we first started First Nations court, we used to hear family court matters, youth court matters, and adult criminal matters all at the same time, like all like this, because it's really kind of silly to separate them out. All those problems, all those issues, all those court orders are interrelated. So there's really no reason why youth matters don't come into Indigenous courts or First Nations courts. There's the only reason given to me back in the day was we were flooded with adult matters in First Nations court, and just it was a capacity issue. And also somebody in somewhere said, well, we think we're already doing a good enough job with Indigenous kids in youth court, so we're not going to refer the cases. By the time I tracked down who that person was, they had gone on to a different job. But there is absolutely no legal reason why youth matters can't come into an Indigenous court. It's a political will and resource issue. If it's a resource issue, assign more sitting days so that those matters can be heard. Youth court matters can come into Indigenous court. It's such an easy thing to do. And Mabel, you may remember, I think when I was in Duncan First Nations court, I think we had youth court. We did. I remember now. We had youth court matters come into First Nations court in Duncan. So it has happened, and there's no reason why it can't continue.
We have another question in the room.
Hi, I'd just like to say thank you for your presentation, and I have a few questions. I wanted to know if there is any ongoing research or data collection, or is there any recent stats of the murdered and missing Indigenous women, men, and LGBTQ? And I want to know if it's increased or decreased since the inquiry, because daily on social media, we're always seeing photos of people looking for their children or women, and later we find out and we'll see that they've been found deceased. So is there any stats or any ongoing programs that are still collecting the data? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. About stats, we ran into a real problem at the National Inquiry trying to figure out how many missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls there were at that point in Canada. And we couldn't come up with an actual hard number, because as we were going through coroner's reports and police reports, there were deaths that were categorized as inconclusive or self-inflicted or unknown, when you read the circumstances, it certainly seemed an awful lot like a murder, because if you have a bullet wound in the back, how can that be self-inflicted? So I don't mean to make light of it. It was just, we couldn't come up with a hard number. The estimates have been as high as over 5,000 by the time we finished our work at the National Inquiry. So then to say, is the number going up or is the number going down, is really hard to say, but there are still Indigenous women and girls, 2S men and boys, going missing and being murdered. It's still happening, but I can't give you a hard number one way or the other. Now, in terms of research and data, good news, fabulous, excellent news to share with you. Part of our calls for justice included data collection, desegregated, I think it's the word, data collection, improved data collection. Our former director of research, Dr. Corinne Duhamel, is now with the MMIWG Secretariat in Ottawa, in charge of that whole research data collection area. And she's already pushing ahead to make change in how data about MMIWG, including men and boys as well, is being collected and kept. So there are advances being made, and I think through the Secretariat, you can be provided with updates of their research. But Dr. Duhamel is doing a fabulous job of just getting that work done, of new data, collecting in a respectful way, collecting in a traditional way, collecting in a sort of statistical, accurate way as well. So watch the NMIWG Secretariat, Dr. Duhamel, and I'm watching, and I'm learning a lot about new data.
Thank you. I have a few comments from online. Darla Rasmussen says, thank you for your work and your teachings. Jonathan Alex has a comment, as organizations, we ought to include overdose awareness with stats covering said numbers. And then a comment from Erin Patterson, I would love to see a GLADU process introduced to CFCA and FLA matters. Is there any ideas how to implement this principle to other courts and legislation?
Oh, great question. Thank you. Again, hold me down, get really excited about this, as you can tell. Back in 2012, 2011, maybe, I'm a little hazy on dates now. I said at the request of the Elders in First Nations Court, we have to establish a family court along these lines. We set out the foundation for an Indigenous family court that would be child protection matters and overlapping FLA matters, if that if that case involved it. We were ready to go. We had court dates set aside. We had files lined up, and someone somewhere in the government said, we have no appetite for doing this at this time. So the whole project was shelved. I went on to the National Inquiry, and the elders involved in First Nations Court in New Westminster pushed to have this Indigenous Family Court brought back online. My goodness, what a force of nature they were, and they made it happen. So there has been and continues to be an Indigenous Family Healing Court operating in New Westminster. And the goal is to return Indigenous kids to their families by supporting the families, not by continuing the foster care industry. It's a wonderful court. It should be all across Canada. Those principles should be applied everywhere. And the success rate, as I understand it, has been very good. There have been some hiccups along the way. It's been a learning experience for everyone, but it's based on Indigenous traditions. It's based on strengthening and supporting the family. And that's the approach that we need to take, in my view.
Wonderful.
I'm
Thank
so
you.
excited about it, as you can tell.
It's an amazing program. We had the opportunity to work with them, Spirit of the Children's Society in New West. We have a question on the floor.
So you just answered my first question, which was how could we implement it with the CFCSA as a previous social worker. I also have a comment as someone who completed high school in 1999. Relearning, you brought that up in your presentation, relearning Canada history. I believe it was you. Mine began again when my kids were in grade 1 and they became my teachers because they are learning a completely different curriculum than I learned. My second question is, in the Fraser Valley, we don't have a First Nations court. Who would I harass to try and implement that in our area and to bring that in? I feel like it's an unmet need in our area. So yeah, any suggestions?
Wherever you are in British Columbia, if you feel you need in your community an Indigenous court, be it a criminal court or a family court, doesn't matter which one, the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court of British Columbia is your go-to person. Now, local judges as well can be a resource for you, but the ultimate decision is with the Chief Judge. And she's a lovely woman. Her name is Melissa Gillespie. I think you'd find her very open-minded.
Wonderful. We have a few more comments from online. Erin Patterson and Sue Ward comment that they are inspired. And Mary Angus comments, yes, the elders panels are a powerful force. We have another comment from Sue Ward. I think the provisions for conferencing are underutilized. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, Section 19 allows for a conference involving all of the key players. Could be elders, family, Native court workers, MCFD workers, and the judge. Yet I seldom see this used. Not sure about the other types of court, as it's not my experience.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. You know, that was something that was, and I'm assuming still is, way underutilized. And that's sort of the approach that we took with bringing youth court matters into First Nations court and Indigenous courts, for that matter. You know, it's just, you know, people do what's familiar. And so they just continue to do the same old, doing the same old way, and they don't look at all of the options. And I really think it's the role of a Native court worker, of a youth court worker, of a judge, of a lawyer, be Crown or defense, to use all of those options that are available. Some people say, well, there are no resources. Well, nonsense. What well, tell me, what resources do you need to do this? Everybody is already in place doing their work. We're just going to move them from a courtroom into a conference room. It's so simple. It's ridiculously simple is what it is. So I agree. There are lots of options available. They're there for a reason. It's just people just get into a rut and do it the same way all the time. Push them out of that rut.
Are there any other comments online or in the room? I'm sure there's lots of thinking going on. Honorable Buller, thank you for your incredible leadership and the gift of all of your knowledge sharing with us today. I'm looking down at the camera instead of at that camera, looking down at the screen. I'm wondering if we can ask Marco and Drew to do us a favor and have the camera go on the crowd so we can just say a huge thank you to Honorable Buller today for spending time with us, and just to hands up. And if everyone can turn around and wave as well. It wouldn't be appropriate to have a Zoom call without those awkward Zoom waves, right?
Oh yeah, that too. That's for later.
All right, wonderful. Thank you all so much. It's been an incredible morning with so much food for thought. And speaking of food, we'll take about a 15-minute break. I can't read what time it is. 20-minute break. There is coffee, tea, juice, water in the room. There are some snacks left over, some pastries, and a little bit of fruit yet from breakfast, which is really delicious. So if everyone would like to just take a break, just a reminder to wear your masks when we all know that, when we're out there. Thank you so much.